So this week we're talking about the New York City and the architecture, the city planning of this city, and I'm calling it New York City Highlights from a Cultural Wonderland. So essentially New York is sometimes called the capital of the world. It's the financial capital of the world, certainly, well, one of the financial capitals of the world, and the most populous city in America. But in any case, it's also a very cultural city. As the most populous city in America, as one of the centers of finance, it's built up this incredibly dense culture. And I want to impart on you tonight the idea that this was not just a spontaneous occurrence, and this is not just because people were rich in New York. Certainly the wealth facilitated that, and it's a huge, huge part of the city planning of New York, this idea of commerce. But importantly, it's the city planning that with using that wealth that facilitates culture, that the culture didn't just appear, it was planned that way, and each piece of architecture in the city plays or at least a good architecture, plays a very important role in being a center of culture and facilitating the culture around it and creating a community around the great buildings. And so I'm going to show you this by basically choosing individual masterworks as case studies. And I'm splitting this presentation into these eight parts, and taking individual examples to show you. And eventually, after a few dozen examples, hopefully, you'll see what I mean. So first of all, we need to go over a short historical overview of New York, looking at New York's history. And New York, at least the white settlement of New York, dates back to the 1600s, the early 1600s. It was not originally New York. It was originally called New Amsterdam. It was the capital of a colony named the New Netherlands. And it was, the last director governor, of New Netherlands and New Amsterdam was a man named Peter Stuyvesant. And at that time, New Amsterdam only encompassed the very southern tip of Manhattan. Today, this area would basically be only one neighborhood in Manhattan out of scores. And so you can see just how much New York has grown, that now New York sprawls in the entirety of Manhattan with dozens of times of this size, as well as the Bronx and Staten Island, Governor's Island, as well as Queens and Brooklyn, even now as far as Flushing. And so it's a huge amount of expansion since then. And Stuyvesant, well, I should say that one piece of history that is often forgotten is that before the white settlers, there were the Lenape Native Americans who were an Algonquin group. The Lenape actually gave the island of Manhattan its name, and they called it Manhattan. And this was taken by the Dutch for the term Manhattan Island. But it became New York after British gunboats came at the end of Peter Stuyvesant's career and asked for the turning over of New Netherlands to Great Britain. And of course, they renamed the colony in New York after Peter Stuyvesant allowed the island to be turned over without a single shot fired or without bloodshed. It was his decision to continue the commerce. And this is important because Stuyvesant was not an official under the crown, or at least not directly. He was an employee. He was an employee of the Dutch East Indies Corporation. What that means is that the crown, the Dutch crown was not the ones who were exploring. It was companies focusing on finance and commerce. As early as the 1600s, almost 400 years ago, New York was built on commerce, on capitalism. And this makes sense because the Netherlands were one of the earliest adopters of this idea of capitalism. At that time, it was called mercantilism. But they were one of the earliest adopters. And you can see that sort of imprint on the early New York City. This is not original Dutch architecture, but this is a street in Greenwich Village, which is one of the oldest neighborhoods in New York. And although the original Dutch architecture is gone, or Dutch colonial architecture is gone, we see the general idea that the Dutch had in their cities, which was to build row houses. And in other words, there is no space between each apartment unit here. There's no space between each building. There's no area for a garden in between. And it conserves space and it really squishes people in. This is a trademark of the Dutch cities that were in the Netherlands. And it's focusing on commerce. It's focusing on putting as many people in at once. that's how all of what is today New York was settled, basically. That in order to advertise the island for commerce, they gave away what are called patroonships, basically free plots of land to people who come and settle and develop in a commercially successful land. And so that was definitely how New York was developed at first. And so you can see that they came down here and built this early New York in Lower Manhattan. But as time went on, that general spirit that the Dutch cultivated of this city focused on commerce continued. And most famously continued and was implemented in the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, originally designed in 1807, but adopted 4 years later. And this was an extremely important plan because this was one of the first times that a city was not planned organically. As in, the city wasn't just planned along what land claims were already there, what farmers had already built paths there, right? And before in the Middle Ages of Europe, for instance, the paths that farmers built already became the streets in the city. But in this case, the streets were not planned by farmers. They were not planned by land tracts. In fact, existing land tracts had to be destroyed in order to build this plan. It was planned by a central committee of commissioners. It went through a legislature. It went through laws. It was a central government that dictated what should be planned. And they created a gridiron, essentially a grid pattern of streets. This was one of the earliest, way before Chicago, one of the earliest gridirons in America and indeed the world. Incredibly influential because this is how we plan cities today, with a committee of planners that creates a plan and is debated over. And this plan was criticized for being monotonous, but there's a reason for the monotony. There's a logic to it, a mathematical logic that focuses on improving the ability to conduct commerce. All the streets, all the roads are straight, almost perfectly straight. Now, the roads going east to west, in other words, the shorter roads are called streets, and they're planned so that to go from one street to the next, it takes a very short amount of walking. And the longer north-south streets, or north-south roads, are called avenues, and they're planned so that it takes a long time to get from one avenue to the next. Avenues are named so that going from east to west, they rise in number, and streets are planned so that from south to north, they rise in number. And that makes it extremely easy to navigate the city. Like, you don't even need to look at road signs. You don't need to look at a map. All you need to know is what number street and avenue you are on right now, and then what number street and avenue you need to get to. Because you simply go north to increase the street numbers, and you know when you're on a street because when you walk to the next one, you can tell if it's short or long distance. So that makes it very, very easy. For instance, very fast deliveries. In terms of commerce, if you need to buy and sell things right now, it's very easy to run over because you know exactly where you are in the city at almost all times. But there is a criticism that it lacked beauty, that it was monotonous. All of these exactly straight streets, exactly straight squares, exactly straight rectangles. So as a reaction to this strict logic, there was a movement named City Beautiful. And City Beautiful has its roots in Chicago. With Chicago having burned down, it gave a lot of chance for new architects to rise up in what's called the Chicago School. And some of those architects included Daniel Burnham, but there were also New York architects like McKim, and White and Cass Gilbert. And these people planned a new kind of architecture that asked the question, why isn't America, the cities of America, considered to be just as great as the cities of Europe? Why isn't New York, this great and powerful city full of wealth and commerce, why isn't New York considered equivalent to Rome or London or Paris? And so to answer this question, people like Cass Gilbert, Frederick Law said Daniel Burnham went to New York, or went to Europe. They walked the streets of Rome, tried to understand what made these cities different, what made New York and Chicago different from New York and London, or London and Rome. And what they found was, fundamentally, beauty. There's this sort of romantic beauty in the streets of Paris when everything is built in this extremely glamorous way. And so they developed a new architecture named Beaux-Arts. And Beaux-Arts is a French term, so it implies that they use this term to imply that they are taking the art defined by the French Academy of Beaux-Arts, or the Academy of Fine Arts, as a style that they're taking. And this was a neoclassical style. This was a style that called on the ancient styles of Greece and Rome. And they use the styles of Greece and Rome to beautify. They had the idea that if you live in surroundings that are more beautiful, that feel beautiful, then it improves your experience. It improves civic participation. It improves how you feel, it improves your demeanor, and improves how much you want to help in your community. So it was really this idea that we need great public works, these massive structures that would inspire beauty in people. Now, it's easy to look at City Beautiful and Beaux-Arts and say that, oh, they copied Europe. They copied antiquity. But it was more than that. It was antiquity applied to an American sense of democracy, an American sense of civic participation. But we'll get into the validity of that statement in a minute. Fundamentally, in order to fund great public works, that the City Beautiful wanted to create these gigantic neoclassical structures, they needed money. And money wasn't necessarily much to come around, and mainly because they needed to have these northern cities that were very industrial. In the industry in this period of the Industrial Revolution will generate money. Think about Andrew Carnegie, right? And so they need to wait until people like Andrew Carnegie can show up. And so let's look at this first masterwork here, the Brooklyn Bridge, 1870 to 1883. 1870 to 1883, that's the period of an Industrial Revolution. So if we get the beginning of money piling up in cities like New York. And that's considered to be one of the characteristics of the Brooklyn Bridge, that this is one of the earliest works in New York that typify this period, sometimes called the American Renaissance, of huge building projects funded by massive dollars. This bridge is most often studied for being important to engineering. It was designed by the civil engineer John Augustus Roebling. But Roebling was a master of his craft because he noticed that engineering wasn't enough. It needed to be beautiful. Now, all the bridges before this had trusses. In other words, large iron works that filled up the top or bottom of a bridge. But in this case, he used a new technique, steel suspension, using these short wires that come down. That leaves this large amount of space that is open. And he perfectly understood that this means the eye will be artistically carried forth at a high velocity between these two large structures. These are called caissons. And so he makes the caissons very, very large and massive so that they perform a contrast between the large amount of space here. And the caissons are not just regular caissons you'd see today. They're rusticated stone, purposefully left with this rough feeling to appear more romantic, more beautiful. And they're also actually reminiscent of European Gothic. They are neo-Gothic, in particular these arches here. They're called pointed arches. You'd find them in a European cathedral. So consider what this means. This is a cathedral to America. This is a cathedral to the great commerce that is taking place in America at this moment. And it's also a monument, a great grand public monument to the end of the Civil War. Began only 4 years after the Civil War. People in America were not very optimistic, but the appearance of a great public work like this and how dazzling and how massive it is and how beautiful it is showed people that it's time to regain their hope in America. It's time to regain America's trust, or people's trust in America. And so it was a major piece for all of American society. In fact, it took John Augustus Roebling so much work to finish. He actually died before it was done, and his son had to finish it. However, if we think about the infrastructure of New York and the building of the great public works, we can't leave out the New York subway. And out of time consideration, I'm not going to talk about the beginning of New York subway, but rather skip to somewhere near the end, specifically 1972. Let's look at this map for a second. Mainly, I want to show you just how massive New York is. It's got one of the largest subway systems in the world. But this map is very well known and very, very influential for many reasons. Massimo Vignelli, its designer, is one of the most influential designers in history. But this is a strange map. Even today, it looks very, very strange because it's not a map. It's a diagram. Vignelli was very adamant that maps like subway maps ought not to be maps. They ought to be diagrams because the focus of the map shouldn't be navigation. It should be to tell you where the stations are. It's not to navigate between stations, but rather to just tell you what station is next. And so he uses the extremely easy-to-read font of Helvetica. Now, today Helvetica is a little bit overused, but at the time this was revolutionary. This was absolutely groundbreaking. This was one of the moments where Helvetica became popularized, and he used it very well here. Before this map, really, there was this predilection over supposedly beautiful fonts, full of serifs and cute little flourishes. But these fonts focus on being easy to read. He uses bright colors and simple black dots for the actual depictions of the lines, subway lines. Again, so that they stand out to the eye, so that they're easy to read. And the water is not colored blue. The land is colored white. That's not what you normally see. If anything, the water would be white and the land would be yellow. But the idea, again, is so that he's not caring about if you can tell what's land or water. He's caring about that the stops stand out. And he decided they stand out better against white. What's more is, in order for the lines to look more straight, he actually compresses Manhattan so that Central Park is a square. Central Park is not a square. It's a long rectangle. So if you try to use this map to navigate, you would get absolutely lost. In addition, there are 5 boroughs of New York. There's the Bronx, there's the Queens, there's Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Staten Island. Where's Staten Island? It's supposed to be here. It's missing. Because there wasn't a subway at the time. Now, this map did not last very long, and it's very easy to see why. Because people would continuously get lost while they would buy a copy of the subway map and get completely lost trying to navigate. However, it's still very easy to see its influence because we still see Helvetica used across many, many different applications. And we still see this general rule of using very bright colors against dull backgrounds in maps. And also when we're talking about trains, I do want to note here this grand work of architecture designed by McKay, Mead & White, one of the great architecture firms, in fact, the first architecture firm, considered by many to be the first architecture firm, and one of the greatest. They truly took Beaux-Arts style and City Beautiful to the maximum. This is a train station for the Pennsylvania Railroad that takes up an entire city block in Midtown Manhattan. What to notice is that these windows, this is not a train station that functions just as a train station. It is not functionalist like the modernists that come afterward. It is a train station that functions as a method of public art, of public improvement of their lifestyle. You can see just how awful New York is outside of the station. I mean, these tenement buildings here, crowded, no space in between, this amount of like dirt and dust here, and you know, the smog as well. Look at how dense that smog is. But then suddenly rising out of the city is this great public monument. And indeed, these windows function not, like they don't need that in the station. It's not there for a reason to help anything at all. It's simply there to be amazing, to look amazing. They're actually modeled after windows from Rome, ancient Rome. They're called Diocletian windows, modeled after the Diocletian baths of ancient Rome. And so they call antiquity, there's this intellectual splendor there. And just to take a look inside, look at how huge and impressive this is. There's no reason for it to be huge and impressive. Well, it doesn't need to be huge since it's a large train station. But the fact that, you know, why are these columns so ornate? Why is the ceiling full of these beautiful octagonal coffers? It's there to be beautiful, and it's funded by dollars. We'll get into that. We'll get into that because there's a bit of a problem that comes into mind when we think about city beautiful architecture. A big problem. However, keep the McKimmon White firm, keep that building, Penn Station, in your mind, in the back of your mind, because we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. Anyway, so let's get into this idea of New York being built on top of money. Huge and vast amounts of money. And a good way of looking at that is St. Patrick's Cathedral. At the time this was built, it is today built right on Fifth Avenue in the middle of Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan. It's right next to Rockefeller Center. It's a really, really popular place, right? But when it was built, this was actually Uptown Manhattan. Some people considered not even part of the city. And they considered it's a Catholic church, and they considered the Catholic Church in Manhattan to be absolutely insane. They didn't have the money to build this. And they were building it somewhere where they were sure that no one would go to it. No one would go to this church and no one would give it tithes. And they were sure that it was going to be a failure. Today it's one of the most well-loved icons of New York. What happened? Well, the Irish were immigrants to New York. So if you think about who was Catholic at the time, the Catholicism was basically synonymous with Irish. And the Irish were new immigrants to New York. They were discriminated against, both beaten up while trying to immigrate through Ellis Island, and also discriminated in that at times their churches were burned down to the ground by nativists, racists. And they decided to fight back by defying that all and trying to raise money. In fact, they started building this before the Civil War. It took them 20 years. Not because the building really took 20 years to build, but they just needed to raise money. It was 20 years of continuous raising money. In fact, at one point when the building was near completion, they actually held a flea market inside the building. So this was insane. And it shows that it was built on top of money. By the time it was completed, New York had expanded so that where the church was Midtown Manhattan. And they made a great decision then, because now it was right in the middle of the financial center of the world. And it's a huge, huge cathedral designed by one of the great architects, James Renwick Jr. Now, Renwick Jr. you should know because one of his most famous designs is the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C. But here you can see his interpretation. James Renwick Jr. is known for his interpretations of earlier European styles. But here, it's basically a scholarly approach to the Gothic style. This is taking into account the Gothic styles of specifically France and Germany, not so much England, but it's looking at all the different famous cathedrals of France and Germany and amalgamating them into this one design that basically includes all the different high Gothic concepts. We have buttresses with pinnacles on top. We have quatrefoils. Pointed arches. We have a barred tracery rose window. If you don't know what these terms are, just get that he's incorporating so many elements that this is more than just a cathedral. It's a cathedral that feels like a textbook of design. That's what makes us, it's easy to look at it and to say, oh, it's just a Gothic cathedral. There are dozens of these in Europe. No, it's an academic Gothic cathedral. It's a Gothic cathedral that evaluates beauty. And that makes it an American Gothic cathedral. Now, the next building that we're going to look at is a jump in time by about 60, 70 years. But as I said, by the point this church was finished, it was already in Midtown Manhattan. And so let's journey to Midtown Manhattan for a second. So we're looking at this beautiful church. And if we turn right around, look at what's right behind it. So this is a sculpture, Atlas, and the building that's behind it is, known popularly as 30 Rock. It's Rockefeller Center. So what exactly is Rockefeller Center? So Rockefeller Center is named Rockefeller Center because it was developed by John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of the oil magnate. And because they had so much money, they had bought plots of land and buildings in Midtown New York. And so basically, he owned an entire city block and decided to raise it and build on top of that skyscrapers that would become the headquarters of RCA. At that time, one of the great, huge media conglomerates. They owned massive holdings in radio. They would soon even acquire TV and movie holdings, electrical appliances, all sorts of different things. And on that city block, he built 19 different buildings, combined in this great ensemble of buildings, all in a style that was completely new, well, relatively new, and not American. It was French, and it was called Art Deco. But in a way, it was almost made for American audiences, because when you look at this building soars up. So what is Art Deco? Art Deco is a commercial style that was popular in, well, it began in the 1910s. It was popular in America during the 20s and 30s. And you can see it in cities all over America that developed during the 20s and 30s. New York, Miami, Los Angeles, specifically those three cities most famously. But when a city developed in the 20s and 30s, it would feature this kind of architecture. Now, Rockefeller Center is fantastic because there are cars all over the city at this point. There are streets that are busy and full of people. And yet, this block, let's take a look around at this block. People walk here, not a single car comes in. In other words, this is an integration of a pedestrian area. This entire block has a pedestrian walkthrough. And it integrates this into a city full of cars. It does this by having this promenade, which is closed off to cars and is for pedestrians, and also does this by integrating with the subway. Rockefeller understood that the subway system is becoming an important method of pedestrian transport, and so he actually builds this underground concourse for Rockefeller Center that is full of is basically a shopping mall and is directly connected to the subway station, and which happened to be one of the most, and continues to be one of the most popular, or one of the most often stopped at subway stations, one of the busiest. Now, what's important about Art Deco? It's really one of the early modernist styles, one of the earliest modernist styles. And in a way, it anticipated the popularity of the Bauhaus and modernism, or international style modernism that would come later. We see a very restrained method. There's almost no ornamentation. And we also see an emphasis on industrial materials. So beside the stone, what we call spandrels, which are these horizontal elements, the spandrels are decorated with aluminum, which is a new industrial material. It was newly invented during the 20th century. If we look at the aluminum, we have decoration, but decoration only in vertical lines. Why vertical lines? Because vertical lines accelerate your eye upward. So that when you look at it, your eye soars up. This is an amazingly tall building. An amazing tall building. And so what the Rockefeller Center does that was so impressive is that not only did it integrate pedestrians with cars, but also integrated the vertical with the horizontal. And this is a very influential idea. This building, specifically this building, the most famous one, 30 Rockefeller Plaza, was designed by Raymond Hood, who you may know as the designer of the Tribune Tower in Chicago. But Tribune Tower was nothing compared to this building. Tribune Tower was of a very standard Gothic style. This was groundbreaking because, well, many had criticized Art Deco for being stupid, basically. People consider Art Deco to exist only for a commercial reason because Art Deco was restrained. So the idea was, oh, well, these developers, they just don't want to spend money on ornamentation. They just want to spend money on buildings being tall. And that was true. That was completely true. That people like John D. Rockefeller wanted the distinction of having built the world's tallest building. And that's why actually the most famous Art Deco building is probably the Empire State Building. They restrained the exterior so that they could build, taller. They could spend more of their budget on just building taller and taller and taller. But it's not just that. And we can see that even though it's being very restrained here, that the building has a restrained facade, it's still beautiful. And one way it does that is by utilizing a restriction called the 1916 zoning resolution. So in 1916, New York City passed a law that made it so a building's height had to be a percentage of its area. And this was because of the issue that people were walking down the street and couldn't see the sun. People were getting scared that buildings were getting too tall, which is sort of surreal to think about in the time of the Burj Khalifa, and the possibility of building a mile-high skyscraper when, the Empire State Building, which looks puny to today, people were like, that's way too tall, you can't see the sun anymore. But there was that fright. There was that fright that we couldn't, we need to make sure that we can see the sun. And so what Hood does is he builds on a long horizontal base. 30 Rock is on a long horizontal base, and then he bumps it up. There's a jump, and it goes to a less long, but still horizontal, secondary structure, and then it bumps up again, and then after this bump, it soars up, and then bumps several times on top. So then, the actual footprint of the building, the area is very large, but as you go up, the area decreases. But he does that, he bumps up a huge amount, he decreases the area a huge amount the first time he bumps up. And so that creates a slenderness to the building. That creates a sense of vertical velocity. So he proved, in another way to put it, he proved that Art Deco can create a sense of power and beauty that isn't a normal sense. There's a geometrical sense that by utilizing new ways of construction, new ways of thinking about design, you can still create the same amount of beauty, just in a geometrical sense. Now, I do want to briefly touch on the sculptures here. I think they're pretty amazing and show just how much commerce influenced this building. So the sculpture in the middle is symbolic of wisdom. Now, remember that this is RCA's offices. RCA did radio, and they did electrical appliances. GE was actually the parent of RCA at the time. And so, thus, on the left is a sculpture of sound, and on the right is a sculpture symbolizing light. There you go, corporate imagery. And of course, behind us is the famous, really Rockefeller Center skating rink. Yeah. Anyway. But I'm not going to talk about the Empire State Building because it's sort of obvious. Everyone knows about the Empire State Building. But I will talk about the Chrysler Building, which is a triumph of Art Deco design. It shows just how decadent it can get. Because, again, Art Deco is a commercial style. It's a style preferred by companies with lots of money in the 20s and 30s. And being that those companies want splendor, they want to show off to the world. Art Deco is a really, really showy style. And the Chrysler Building is an exercise in that. At the time, it was actually the world's tallest building. And it was designed by William Van Allen. Van Allen, there's an interesting story in this. Van Allen really wanted to be the architect who designed the tallest building in the world. And he was in competition with a lot of other architects. So what he'd do is, he'd draw designs for the building in secret. And his design for the building was that it would be topped with a tall spire. And what he'd do is, he was assembling and drawing the spire in secret in the basement of the construction site. And so every now and then he'd go to the other architects and look at what they'd drawn. And when those architects had finished up, they'd publish their work. And so he'd wait until after his competitors had published their work to finalize the design on the spire. And so basically, depending on how high the others built their works, he'd increase the length of the spire. And thus, he basically edged out the second tallest at the time by just 13 feet or something. And so it did actually become the tallest building in the world, although it only held that for about a year before the Empire State Building was finished. However, it's still a terrific building. Let's look at just some of the details here. Art Deco is interested in this idea of streamlining. It's sometimes referred to as streamline moderne. And because, again, it's a commercial style. Corporations want to see themselves as efficient, commercial masters. They want to see themselves as business geniuses. And so to create the sense of efficiency, everything sort of has curves, as if as if the buildings are zooming ahead, as if indeed Art Deco would also design like products, cars, and such, and so everything would have curves as if they're moving, as if they're always going forward. The sense of efficiency, and thus the Chrysler Building comes up and then ends in these gigantic curves, and the building is topped in aluminum, just like 30 Rock, and it has these triangular patterns for windows here, lined with light. It resembles a crown. It's almost like a diamond crown, glittering in the night. How showy can you get? When your corporate headquarters, this was a corporate headquarters for Chrysler at the time, when your corporate headquarters is literally a giant diamond flipping everyone off. I mean, it's a slender building, resembles a finger sort of, It's a gigantic diamond-encrusted crown that's flipping everyone off because it's the tallest building in the world. So, but when you look inside, it's just that sense of showing off, that sense of being as beautiful and as jaw-dropping as you can to edge out all your competition. That sense of corporate capitalism imbued into design is everywhere. I mean, every single inch of this building has been decorated by something. Not in the traditional sense. There are no cherubs, angels, but there are frescoes, modernist frescoes, flattened, to give you a sense of efficiency, that depict workers, that depict cars zooming forward, And instead of, traditional Renaissance-style frescoes, we get stone that come down in these squiggles and lines. The floor is full of geometric modernist patterns that are talking about, pushing modernism and industrial work, Even here in the brickwork, you have triangular, jutting forward bricks that are sharp angles. In fact, here the brickwork is literally cars. And then the brickwork are cars for Chrysler, right? It comes up to this aluminum ornament, which this is that ornament. It's actually a hubcap. There's a hubcap on top of a brickwork car on the Chrysler Building. And then on near the very top of the building are these massive aluminum eagles that have since become symbols of New York. So imagine that, not only are you the world's tallest building, but your corporate headquarters literally have these eagles looking out of the city, watching over everyone. But we need to think about this idea of showing off, right? So buildings like the Chrysler Building and 30 Rock, they're all about, we're the best, we're efficient, and we're flashy and showy, we're better than everyone else. That's something called the New York style. So the Chicago school that invented the skyscraper came up with the theoretical ways to design a skyscraper. But after that, some of the Chicago architects came to New York, such as Daniel Burnham. He was a Chicago school architect who came to New York and looked at a new style that basically Daniel Burnham was the beginning, or one of the earliest beginnings of the idea of being showy, of being really flashy. And Chicago's work was restrained. It was modernist. They focused on having a large a large area of the facade being covered in windows. It focused on this sort of tripartite design. And so this still has the tripartite design, as in like there's a top part, there's a middle part, there's a bottom part. It still has a tripartite design. It still has lots and lots of windows. But what's different about it? Well, all we need to do is look at the top here. This is the top part, the top third of that tripartite design. And just look at how covered an ornament is. I can't name all of these. But I'm going to try. There are rosettes tucked in between corbels. And in fact, on the very top, there are even two cherub sculptures looking out over the city of Manhattan. There are triglyphs. There are egg and dart string courses. There's an architrave on top of Corinthian columns, which, by the way, are the most showy flashy column there is. There are coins that are both drums in this case that are both fluted and unfluted, as well as coins. There are roundel medallions, and there are Morag and dart string courses. There's a dentile string course. It's so full of everything. And even the windows are overly emphasized. These huge, overly emphasized rounded arch. Well, I wouldn't say overly emphasized, but certainly emphasized to as much as they can. Chock full of sculptures in terracotta, decorations at every single inch. That's what makes the New York style different from the Chicago school. The New York style is about flashiness, So this is the birth of that same idea of flashiness. Even though this is a Beaux-Arts building that is more in line with City Beautiful, this is still that idea of flashiness that we see in the Art Deco. And indeed, there's more flashiness that is Beaux-Arts. So it's not just Art Deco that is flashy. This is the Woolworth building by Cass Gilbert. And you can see that 1912, this is 10 years after the Flatiron building, which we saw before. It looks sort of less ornate. And that's because Cass Gilbert, as a proponent of City Beautiful, is actually a conservative in architecture, one of the very famous conservatives. He continued to work into the 1930s when modernism was at full force already, at least in Europe. Cass Gilbert refused to change his style. Cass Gilbert was a classical, neoclassical, Beaux-Arts practitioner all his life. We see that in this building, in this particular building, it is interpretation of Gothic. And we can see that in sort of the top here, that the top, they have Gothic pinnacles. But also the interior. So this building is popularly known as the Cathedral of Commerce. The Cathedral of Commerce. Woolworth, we don't know them today, but at the time they were the largest retail company in existence. They were hugely rich and they wanted to show off. The same idea, right? That you want to show off that because my building is extremely flashy, it's flashier than yours. This Gilded Age mentality of just burning money. And look at how beautiful this interior is. Every inch lined with gold, some sort of enameled material, either gold or this beautiful green. There's glass here, glass and steel lit by light that comes in, and these Gothic, this Gothic sort of choir shade here, beautifully decorated. And what's important is that you have this Gothic element that looks sort of like the choir shade to a church. You also have a rounded arch here and these tall ceilings that sort of look like a church. It looks like cathedrals of Europe. So that's why it's called the Cathedral of Commerce, because it looks like a cathedral of Europe, but instead of being white like a cathedral, instead of being white and instead of being about God, this is fueled by the money of the Woolworth Corporation. It's a monument not to God, but to a corporation. And it's not the restrained style of the old Gothic. This is a neo-Gothic absolute decadence. I mean, there's not an inch here that isn't covered in some sort of enamel. But at the same time, so I think I've imparted to you now that the Beaux-Arts, the City Beautiful, is about money. It's about flashiness. And specifically, they're funded by rich people, the big corporations. But sometimes rich people can do good things too. Sometimes rich people give Beaux-Arts firms, like Carrere and Hastings in this case, money to build massive public works. And this is a building, New York Public Library. This is one of the great Beaux-Arts buildings of all time that was funded by rich people. In fact, if you look closely at the top of the building here, it actually lists the names of the benefactors in these sort of plates here. Among the names are John Jacob Astor. I'm sure you know the Astor Hotel chain. So, really rich guy, donated a lot of money. James Lennox, Samuel J. Tilden, former presidential candidate. again, very, very rich man, donates money for this library. And so, in typical Beaux-Arts fashion, it's neoclassical, having the Corinthian columns of antiquity, the coins of, again, antiquity. It revives the Greek and Roman styles, so there's a Greek-style pediment, but also Roman-style exuberance in the sculpture. But what's really amazing about the New York Public Library, what makes it truly one of the great all-time Beaux-Arts masterpieces, is the inside. There are huge coffers decorated by paintings. And this is the Rose Reading Room. It's unbelievably huge. Unbelievably huge. And there are thousands of reference books stacked against these bookshelves. The idea here is that using the monies of the rich and applying the ideas of City Beautiful, we can create an environment that transfers that beauty of the rich and powerful to the common public. So that the public, the New York citizen, can come to this library and read and do research in this massive library. Well, they weren't always public works. So I should, with Morgan Library, it is the exact opposite. So while rich people liked to donate money to create great public works, they also like to donate money, well, not donate money, but get works that were completely decadent and self-centered. And this is a great example. The Morgan Library, designed by the great McKim White. It's called the Morgan Library because it was commissioned by J.P. Morgan. It was his personal study as well as a library, so it was basically a workplace for him. And so it's his personal workspace that takes a lot of city space and is unbelievably decadent. There's no way that you look at this building and can think, oh, well, J.P. Morgan was not self-centered. And I'll show you what I mean. These are the bronze doors to enter. Huge bronze doors, all right? You enter the bronze doors to a complete marble-decked foyer. These are mosaics on the ceiling, complete with marble, these are actually relief sculptures. Yeah, these are reliefs, marble reliefs. Here we see this kind of marble is an extremely rare type named porphyry. Today, Morgan Library is a museum actually displaying the collection of J.P. Morgan, which includes rare books, so that's why you see all these cases. He basically collected rare books and rare paintings. He focused on the most rare of the rare. So there are like letters from George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. There are original manuscripts of Alice in Wonderland. There's paintings from like the 1200s. It's an amazing, amazing place. I recommend a visit. But let's assume that we're guests of Mr. Morgan. We're here to discuss a business transaction. So let's walk into his study. Welcome to Mr. Morgan's study. Okay, so here's this chair. Right here is where J.P. Morgan will be sitting. Right behind his massive desk and his velvet chair, and the entire room is completely decked in velvet wallpaper with these massive wood coffers, right? And he's got a painting of himself that he's looking at all day. He's got Renaissance sculptures looted from Europe. Not kidding. These windows, they include stained glass that were literally taken out of European cathedrals and put in here. This is how decadent it is. It is unbelievable. Now let's take a visit. Mr. Morgan is done chatting with us, and he wants us to, let's see. Now he wants us to wait for his decision to our proposal in his library. Let's look at his library. Huge, gigantic Middle Ages tapestry taken from Europe, okay? Look at this, 3 stories of rare books. Literal first editions of like Voltaire and Diderot stacked on the shelves. More mosaics and paintings dedicated to poetry, music, painting. Right? more Renaissance sculpture. You get the point. This is unbelievably decadent. Very fortunately, it is open to the public today, and it is absolutely wonderful for a visit. I mean, you get the original Gutenberg Bibles, old paintings of Martin Luther when he was still alive. It is unbelievable there. But in any sense, you get the point. Now let's talk about. So we see that the rich can benefit themselves. They can build flashy buildings. They can also benefit the public. But perhaps the greatest moment when the rich decided to benefit the public was in building Central Park. One of the great practitioners of City Beautiful, Frederick Law Olmsted, designed the plan for Central Park. He is America's greatest, most influential, most well-known landscape architect. And when he designed this, he actually had never drawn a plan before. And so in order to gain some credibility, he partnered with an established architect, Calvert Vaux, and what they created was absolutely amazing. Vaux basically designed all these structures within the park, pavilions, buildings, etc. And Frederick Law Olmsted did everything else, essentially. And when we talk about landscape architecture, we usually consider that there are two classical traditions. There's a French tradition, which is seen in somewhere like the Palace of Versailles, which is basically perfectly maintained gardens with these little geometric shapes and little water features and stuff. And then there's also the English tradition, which is trying to mimic wild environments. It's trying to mimic the outside, but in a very controlled setting. The Central Park is designed in the English style. So it is not a park we would consider today. The modern conception of the park would probably include playgrounds, probably include a baseball field, tennis court, something like that, right? A swimming pool. This was not the old conception of a park, and this was a classical conception of a park. No amenities. Frederick Law Olmsted made it very clear in his plan that there were no amenities in this park, no baseball fields, but in a way, even though there were no amenities, so you can consider it as a posh bourgeois park because it doesn't really provide anything material to the residents of the city, in a way it's actually very liberal. And I'll get into that. The main mastery of the park is that it combines several different types of landscape together with it seamlessly. So here we see a sort of, it's almost like the Catskill Mountains, this image. But this is Central Park in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, well, uptown, I guess. This serene sort of area that with lots of water that feels like the mountains. Beautiful bridge. There are more than 40 bridges in Central Park. Every single one of them is completely unique, designed by Calvert Vaux. And they are basically made to complement the environs. And it's very important that every single step, every single moment in Central Park was designed. There is barely a blade of grass which was not drawn by Frederick Law Olmsted. It was all planned. And so you have images like this that could be in a mountain, or an image like this that could be in a wild forest. The fact that this tree bows like this and it echoes the bow of the bridge, that's not a mistake. That's not a mistake. That Frederick Law Olmsted drew that. Again, almost every blade of grass. Even the fact that this is not paved or doesn't have any bricks, that's purposeful. And then there are other sections of the park so it could look like a mountain, it could look wild, like a wild trail, and there are other sections that look completely built, like a public forum. But then there are other built sections that look not like a public forum, they look sort of fantasy land, right? And then there's also another type of environment which is complete open field. And this is what I mean by being very liberal. In a way, even though it didn't provide amenities, it did differ from the English style by providing, the English style did provide lawns. There were many lawns in the English style. But in this case, being in the middle of a city and providing this long meadow in the park provides a place for people to picnic, to run around and toss a frisbee. So there was still a consideration that there be a meadowland providing for the people in the city. But what to understand is that, mountain, built environment, wild land, meadow, all of these come into each other very seamlessly, and every single step of the way is planned. So, in other words, you can walk outside of a trail and come into the meadow and not even expect it at all. Oftentimes, when you come into the meadow, you would actually have to take some stairs or turn a corner, and so you basically be in a dense forest, turn a corner, and suddenly you'd be in a meadow. But in any case, with the construction of great public works, New York finally becomes this truly great city. And then the Great Depression hits. That's really that Art Deco really doesn't have any great works after maybe 1932, 1933, because that's when the Great Depression starts to take effect. New York, just like every city, just like every place, came into some difficult financial decisions, came into issues economically. But ironically, that was actually a really good situation for New York. Because with FDR, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected, his New Deal gave different municipalities a lot of money for public works in order to alleviate the effects of depression. So, in the case of New York, it got lots of money from the New Deal, and it just so happened that the city planner at that time was a man named Robert Moses. This man. And Moses is truly amazing and truly awful. There's a story that, first of all, I should tell you what he did in childhood. Before he was even city planner, he actually one day he just had an idea, took out a piece of paper and drew the entirety of the city of New York as it appeared, and then completely redesigned it. As in, he looked at every single street, every single bridge, every single building, and built and drew a completely new city of New York. And in his time in office for almost 30 years, he was city planner of New York. He gained a huge amount of political power as a bureaucrat. He is the iconic bureaucrat, at one point holding 12 different titles. And so what that means is that as planner, you have to get an idea approved to start building. But by holding 12 different titles, he was basically the boss of himself, who was the boss of himself, the boss of himself. So he didn't need to get any approval whatsoever. He just went ahead and did stuff. But doing this, he could get large sections of his plan that he drew basically as a child done. And there's this amazing story, and initially that New Deal money helped him do this. There's this amazing story that he planned a new park, and he was building this new park. And he did not want poor people going to the park, because this man he's amazing, but he's also really, really awful. He was a racist. He was completely a bigot class-wise. And he saw poor people and minorities as dirty and filthy. And so he did not want poor people coming to the park, particularly Puerto Ricans. He hated Puerto Ricans, but he knew that Puerto Ricans would want to come to the park. So what he did was, he figured out that Puerto Ricans happened to be poor on the poorer side, and so they did not have cars. So he built the park so that only one bridge comes into the park, and the bridge travels under an overpass, and that overpass was just low enough so that so that buses could not get through that overpass. Just low enough so that the public transportation couldn't get to the park. And in that way, he denied access to the park in the most evil way to Puerto Ricans. It's impossible to imagine someone who went through so many hoops to basically destroy minorities and destroy communities. But in any case, in many ways, he was a miracle. He is the most important city planner in America, certainly, perhaps the world, because he had this idea of the modern city. He basically founded the idea of the modern city, that the modern city depends on transportation, fundamentally transportation. And so that's why he built roads, parkways, he called them. Parkways, huge 8-lane expressways that basically tore through Manhattan. In fact, one of the ways that he got pushed out of office was that one of his last ideas was basically to demolish Greenwich Village. We'll get into that in a minute. To demolish Greenwich Village and build a massive expressway as well as a bus station and a bridge through Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan. He built several bridges. He built many, many parks. But his most prized possession was Queens. So at this point, New York has been continuously growing. It is now, New York basically encompasses all of Manhattan now and has also incorporated Brooklyn, as well as Queens. But at this point, Queens was basically this big garbage dump, literally. If you've ever read The Great Gatsby, in Gatsby, there's a section where they talk about the ash dump that they need to drive through when they're going from the very wealthy part of Long Island, the Gold Coast, to Manhattan. They need to drive through ash dumps. Those ash dumps is what's today Queens, and those ash dumps was specifically made into what's today Corona Park. We'll get into that in a minute. Corona Park. But basically, Moses created highways for cars, and also the airports had to be put in less populated areas of New York, specifically Queens. That's specifically LaGuardia Airport was put into Queens. And so Moses decided to develop Queens into basically a suburb within the city. He understood that people will want to drive cars, will want to be in planes, and they will want to live in suburbs so they can commute to the city. So why not, to prevent the decline of the city, build a suburb within the city? That's what he did. Take a look at this image here. This is in Queens. It doesn't look that much different from a suburb. The houses are lower. There aren't many skyscrapers. The streets are much quieter. There are a lot more trees. It looks like a suburb. The idea was that he would maintain rich people to live in New York. I mean, remember, this guy's a racist. He's a bigot. So he wanted to basically build nothing. By building highways in Manhattan, he was raising down huge sections of neighborhoods for the poorer people and the minorities, and then building up Queens. These were houses that were far away, so you needed cars. So essentially, these were houses for the rich, and he builds these like sterile sort of storybook environments for the white rich people. But by doing this, at the same time, he was a genius. He was evil, no doubt about it, but he was a genius because this did successfully stave off the decline of New York City after World War II for a while. Most cities after World War II declined very rapidly. For instance, Chicago saw huge amounts of population decrease, saw rampant crime. New York was able to keep that away because of Queens, because of Robert Moses' ability to adapt to the new city. A city full of parks that had amenities, a city full of highways, and one way it did that was to advertise Queens as this new New York. And he did that by convincing the International Commission, to let New York host the 1964 World's Fair. So Robert Moses decided to specifically clear away the ash dumps that were written about in The Great Gatsby to create Corona Park, and he decided to host the 1964 World's Fair in Corona Park. So imagine this, if you will. People from all around the world coming to this World's Fair. It was one of the most popular World's Fairs. And they'd be flying into Queens through LaGuardia. And they'd be walking through Queens to get to the World's Fair pavilions. And when they got there, at the middle of the World's Fair was this great globe filled with dozens of fountains all around it. The idea was that this is symbolizing that New York is a center of the world. We've always been the center of the world, and now we're back again. So come to New York, right? And it contrasts greatly with the parks of Olmsted. So, before I get into that, you can see here that it's a lot more sterile than an Olmsted Park. It's not about every step of the way you turn around. Instead, there are tennis courts here. There are baseball and basketball courts. And a lot of it is built. There's a stadium in the background. And this here, today is a theater. Originally, it was a New York State Pavilion. for the World's Fair. And you can see that it's a lot more sterile. However, I think the greatest point in the 1964 World's Fair and to symbolize or emblematic of Robert Moses' attempts to advertise New York is the fact that he spent over $1 million in the money of the 1964. Today, over $10 million in today's money. Over $10 million to build a massive scale model of New York that was advertising New York to come to New York to the wealthy people around the world. Let's take a look at just how massive and ridiculous this thing is. So the panorama of New York is today held in the Queens Museum, which is in Corona Park. It's a good museum. It's a very good art museum. Anyway, so let's talk about for a minute the fall of Robert Moses. Robert Moses in 1963 made one of his biggest mistakes of his career, and indeed the biggest mistakes in New York history. He decided to demolish Penn Station. Remember that great massive train station that we saw earlier, designed by McKim, and White, this monument to New York? He decided to demolish it because he wanted to build this great modernist and really, really ugly, unfortunately, building in its place that would be a skyscraper. So it was more efficient in terms of cost, but unfortunately, people didn't really notice until it was too late, and he was successful. However, people realized now that they had given Robert Moses too much power. That after almost 30 years, they realized that he had done so much harm to New York, that he had just been blatantly demolishing neighborhoods, that he had been doing really racist things, and destroying a lot of the architectural heritage of New York. And one of the people who really sounded the alarm was this woman, Jane Jacobs. She wrote a book called The Life and Death of the American City, in which she argued that so-called urban revitalization, in other words, the modern idea of the city, is flawed. It's completely wrong. Because, is it really revitalization? She basically outlined, was really the first to outline the problems with city planning, with Robert Moses' ideas that I talked about earlier, the fact that it was not really city planning, it was city planning for the rich. It was focusing on building buildings for the rich, houses for the rich, cars and planes focusing on cars and planes, which are things that the rich would use, and destroying the existing urban fabric. She argued about this thing called street culture, that there is a culture to the street, that people will walk down the street and they will see so-called blight, but what is so-called blight is really an existing culture, a melting pot of generations who have been there and immigrants who have mixed and mingled, and bohemians, artists, musicians of all sorts. This was a unique culture that people like Robert Moses was destroying. And she particularly focused on Greenwich Village, that very, very old neighborhood that I showed in the beginning. And so she looked at Greenwich Village in detail, and she argued for the saving of Greenwich Village, and she won. She was able to, because of the popularity of her ideas, Robert Moses was basically forced out of power. And ever since then, we had this idea of we need to preserve street life. We can't just force minorities outside of the city, and we can't just rampantly demolish places. Well, ironically, that would actually lead to gentrification, because places like Greenwich Village would become, and this is actually new ideas that people are considering about today, because ironically, her ideas ended up forcing out minorities anyway, because white people would read her works. They would go, wow, Greenwich Village is so amazing. They'd come to Greenwich Village really wanting an apartment in Greenwich Village, which drives up the price, which means that apartment landlords will use predatory techniques to force the people who are in the tenants who are already there out, so then they can rent those same apartments for higher prices. And unfortunately, that meant driving out the existing tenants. But anyway, briefly, let's look at museums in New York. And let's talk about how culture is cultivated here. There's the Metropolitan Museum, which is definitely the most famous of the museums. The original building was designed by Calvert Vaux. People really didn't like it. It was a red brick building. People wanted something prettier. And so they hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt. Richard Morris Hunt is very, very important in American culture because his most famous work is the Biltmore Mansion. You've all probably seen it on TV or movies or something, but the Biltmore Mansion is one of the largest houses in America. So he was definitely one of these Beaux-Arts architects who worked for the rich, but at the same time, here was a massive public work, and so his most famous part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art Design is this great hall here. Massive marble-filled area where today is basically where you buy your tickets. And it's really fantastic. It's got these massive domes, pendentives, wonderful place to an amazing place that brings you into this warm and illustrious area, readies you for the vast amount of art that you will encounter. The Metropolitan of Art is today the largest and most popular art museum in America. It is unbelievably huge, and it will take days to get through it. Here's the exterior. This section here is a section designed by Richard Morris Hunt. These wings that come out this way were actually designed by McKimmey & White. But you can see in Richard Morris Hunt's design that it is definitely the illustrious Beaux-Arts design. You can see through this that he is clearly, just through this facade, he is clearly a master of his craft. Well, it's extremely ornate. But now, just the MoMA is huge. There are actually two expansions to MoMA. We'll get into those in a minute. Oh, the Met. I meant the Met. There are two expansions to the Met, and we'll get into those in a minute. So MoMA was actually founded by John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s wife. She was very interested in modern art. In fact, 30 Rock was originally supposed to have a modern art fresco adorning it. Very famous fresco. It's Diego Rivera's Man at the Crossroads. But if you know anything about that piece, it's actually also socialist, and it would not fit in a very commercial building. You know, it's a headquarters of a massive global conglomerate. So when John D. Rockefeller came over, Rockefeller's like, oh, my wife, you can just choose a work, whatever, And when he saw that, he was like, no. So they actually had it removed and were going to destroy it before the Detroit Museum of Art bought it. But anyway, MoMA is, well, I don't really need to say anything about it, do I? I mean, it has all the famous works and is the world's most popular, most famous place for modern art. Worth a visit anytime. I've been to it 6 times now. It's just every single time you go, it's always illustrious. And it's one of the world's best film collections as well. The Guggenheim Museum has a lot of interesting architecture. If you look at it, it's actually, people most won't know it for being this circle that rises up. It's actually more of a rectilinear shape on the bottom, and then the circle comes out of the rectilinear shape. So it's this interesting circle in a square. In fact, if you look at the pavement, it's hard to see in this picture, but there's actually the pavement is actually circle and square as well. Like each step on the pavement is a circle and a square. But if you look at the inside, that curvilinear idea of circle rising up is repeated. The experience of the museum is really amazing. You actually take an elevator to the top and you walk down the ramp all the way down to the bottom, and then you're done. The exhibits in this museum are always amazing, and it's always changing. So each time you go to the Guggenheim, it's completely different. But in any case, let's move now to modernism. So now we've seen Art Deco, we've seen the Beaux-Arts and the New York style skyscraper. In the 50s and after World War II, well, actually before World War II, they had already moved to America. Essentially, the European modernists who had developed ideas like the international style specifically in places like the Bauhaus came to the United States to escape the horrors of World War II. And they came to the United States, and thus they spread their ideas of the international style to the United States. And one of the earliest international style buildings in New York is the United Nations complex, built in 1952. This man is very famous. But this man led the architecture. So his name's Oscar Niemeyer, and the other man's Le Corbusier, often called Corbu by architecture fans. Oscar Niemeyer was Brazilian, Le Corbu was French, and they're both masters of the international style. And Corbusier helped a lot with this building here, the General Assembly. But this building here is the absolute tour de force. It's a Secretariat building. It's a skyscraper that has a feature that was considered really, really rare at the time. In fact, it's arguably the first in New York. It's called a curtain wall. The curtain wall is the idea that the entire wall here, the entire facade, is basically one long sheet, and it's just pasted on. It's just a sheet of glass and metal that is simply applied. And this idea of the curtain wall is really exemplary of the ideas of industry, that you industrially make a curtain wall out of industrial materials, glass and steel, and you just affix it on. So the reason why that's important is that the Bauhaus is really interested in industry. But also I want to note that originally the architects who were involved were Harrison and Abramovitz, a partnership. Specifically, Abramovitz is Max Abramovitz, who is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, of the architecture school. Harrison and Abramovitz were fans of Oscar Niemeyer. They actually asked Niemeyer to come over from Brazil and design the Secretariat building. And let's just look at the Secretariat building. It is not just transparent glass. It is blue. It's slightly blue. And the fact that it's on the river, it matches the water. And the blueness contrasts with the white-gray color of this facade here, which is, I can't remember if it's marble or granite, but in any case, it is not actually plain white. It is actually subtly changing in squares. It's split into these squares that intersect and change from white to gray and back to white again. And so this subtle change in color and this perfection in proportion and how it's a clean rectangular square and this innovation in curtain wall design is what made the United Nations building truly very influential. But the influence was multiplied with arguably the second curtain wall building in New York was a Lever House, designed by Gordon Bunshaft for the great Chicago architecture firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. So what's amazing about this building is that visually it's split into two parts. There's this pavilion portion that is very horizontal, and then there's this very tall vertical section. And at first, if you don't look closely, it looks like two different buildings. You don't really see them together, but they are actually connected. What's fantastic about this building is, unlike the United Nations building, the windows are completely transparent. They're not really tempered at all. And so what it creates is this beautiful international style, modernist aesthetic of being like a membrane. The glass has this sort of efficiency, this industrial beauty of being able to see through one side and not the other. You can see right through. And it's that clear glass that might be energy inefficient. It is. But in any case, it is a beauty to look at. It's almost like Gordon Bunshaft has just created floors and then draped a piece of cloth in front of it. It's a delicacy that makes this building truly terrific. But the ultimate modernist masterpiece in New York is the Seagram building, designed a couple years later by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Philip Johnson did help with it, but the main reason he was there is because Mies was not licensed fully in New York and required Philip Johnson, who was licensed. If we look at this building, it soars upward. If you're standing on the bottom and look up, it just flies upward. And that's because the piers here, the vertical elements, we call them piers in architecture. Vertical elements or piers are not flat. They're actually these I-beams that are taped, or not taped, but affixed on the outside. They are decoration, completely decoration. And just like remember in 30 Rock how the vertical lines in the aluminum accelerate your eye upward, same effect. That these are vertical I-beams that accelerate your eye upward, and the I-beams extend the entire length, the entire height of the building. You might look at this and say it's steel. It is not steel. It is bronze. It is bronze specially tempered to look like steel, which is absolutely amazing. And the point that Mies is trying to make here is that the building is supposed to be like a sculpture, in that it is beautiful, it's monolithic. And if we look here at night, it actually lights up as if it was a torch of light, but not in the traditional, it's sort of like a torch of lack of light. So just like how if you're holding a torch, right, or a candle, for instance, the shaft of the candle lacks any light, and then the top of the candle emits light. In this case, it's sort of like a torch of blackness, a torch of darkness, in that the top has no light, and then everywhere else emits light. And the lighting was especially designed so that the lights were positioned along the edge of the building, so that the light would fly out in all directions, as if it was this dark black torch. But the lobby is especially resplendent. We've got these huge glass panes. The second floor and all the other floors are actually above you, and so it's like you've entered that membrane, but there's still another membrane still keeping you out. And the glass is, again, not tempered much, and so you can see right through. And the beauty is in the details here. Mies is famous for saying God is in the details. And the details, by details I mean in this case specifically the materials that he uses. Again, this is actually steel, or bronze. This is actually bronze, not steel. And the tiles here are actually granite. And these blocks are travertine, which is a very, very desirable, really beautiful material. So they're all expensive materials. They're extremely expensive materials. The beauty and the luxury comes through the materials. But I do want to note here that, remember the 1916 zoning resolution, this is a building that cheats it. Because instead of being like, instead of bumping up, what it does is that it leaves the front of the lot open with this public plaza. This is really terrific in that, so that it doesn't need to bump up now because it's decreased, or it's taking up a larger area. But the fact that there's a public plaza integrated into the building is truly a tour de force, because New York, one of the greatest things about the city of New York, and what facilitates a sense of community in New York, I mean, when you're in New York, you really feel New York. You know, it's not like any other place. And one of the ways that happens is through public space. Ever since the Seagram building, which innovated this idea, pretty much every major building since then has featured some sort of public space, either on the outside or on the inside. There's a lot of buildings feature this public space, and there's just public space everywhere. That's actually one of the ways that New York actually now it has improved their policy in that they encourage having public space by overlooking your zoning regulations, so that if you have public space in your building, it can actually let you build higher. It's a new zoning law. So it's a really terrific feature in the city of New York. In 1962, Eero Saarinen, famous for his St. Louis Arch, the Gateway Arch, one of the masters of the international style, he's Finnish, comes from Finland, to build the TWA Flight Center. At this point, he had been in America for a while, but this is one of his greatest masterworks, the TWA Flight Center. And you can see it from the outside. The TWA Flight Center was a terminal. Today it's actually being converted into a hotel. It was a terminal for JFK, for Trans World Airlines. At that time, they were a very major airline. And Eero Saarinen was interested in this idea of the jet age, jet setting, that the jet is a new, efficient, fast way to travel around the world, And what he did was he designed this so that we have these huge open window bays. So that when you're here in the terminal, you can look out and see the jets. In addition, when you're walking to your plane, when you're walking back and forth, you have these amazing sort of really futuristic tunnels that zoom you forward visually. In addition, the overall building structure looks like a bird taking off. And that ceiling, if you look at the interior, there really are no supports that hold the ceiling up. There are no columns. That's because this ceiling is actually one huge gigantic piece. It's called a shell structure. Well, I guess it's three different pieces, but they're basically huge pieces that are anchored down in these gigantic pillars. So then there are no columns required inside. And of course, inside it's really beautiful as well. Sarn was an absolute freak over efficiency, and so the idea is that you can just walk in and walk straight to a jet out the other way. Now, I want to give you the sense that New York was really a mecca for great architects, and still is today. You know, you might go to, if you're an architect, you might go to Tokyo to build a really big building. You might go to Abu Dhabi to build a really tall building. But at the end of the day, you're still coming back to New York to build your most famous building, to build your most artistic building. New York is where you show off your artistic skills. It's where your craft reaches its height. And it's where you make an announcement to the world stage of what your style is. And so even for accomplished architects like Walter Gropius, who had founded the Bauhaus, so very well-known architect, way past his prime, he still was coming to New York to get this prestige project. You know, this is a prestige project that he's attaching his name to, and it's in the mecca of architecture. And it's the MetLife building. Well, today it's called the MetLife building. At the time it was called Pan Am building because it was headquarters of Pan Am, which is another major airline. And they actually had a helipad on the top here. It's no longer used. But at the time it was built, it was the largest office building in the world. That poses a problem that if you're designing the international style that Walter Gropius was one of the progenitors of, it gets a little bit bland when you have massive facades on all four sides full of just repeated stained glass. What can you do? What can you do? Walter Gropius had this brilliant idea of taking this huge box and twisting, basically making it into a trapezoid sort of shape, right? Basically making it into two trapezoids put together. And he basically pushes the two sides. Well, here, I'll explain this way. The facade, he spent a 3/3, and he pushes the left and right third back just a little bit, to make the building seem lighter. And you can see in profile the footprint of the building and just how small that twist was. But that twist was especially necessary because it's actually right behind Grand Central Station. So if he hadn't twisted, imagine Grand Central Station and then right behind it is just a sea of metal. That wouldn't look very good. So because he twisted it, instead Grand Central Station is only behind really like the middle third is the only flat face of steel that's behind Grand Central. And so it alleviates the look of the building. But really, one of the great buildings is, originally it was the Whitney Museum. Today is the Met Breuer because it was purchased, or rented from the Whitney by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is an extension of the Met where they basically do rotating exhibits on modern and contemporary art. And it's designed by Marcel Breuer. Breuer was basically, he studied under Gropius, Walter Gropius, at the Bauhaus, but he was a generation younger. Marcel Breuer although he was a modernist at such an early age, as he grew up, he realized that he needed to come away from the strict international style and create a style of his own, because his career was going to be much longer than Walter Gropius's, since he started early. So he moved into a new style, brutalism. Brutalism is all about concrete. Now the exterior here is not actually concrete, but what should be it should be clear that brutalism does not mean brutal-looking architecture. It actually is based off the French word for concrete. And his building here looks sort of like a castle almost, and he does sort of a self-parody on that, in that there's actually a moat. You actually have to cross a sort of drawbridge to get into the building. But that's one of the criticisms that brutalism has, that it looks, well, brutal. It looks too much like a castle or fortress. But when you enter the building, it's clear that it's not. This is a lobby. Wow, right? One of the Bauhaus tenets is that we have to celebrate industrialism. We have to celebrate this new technologies and industry. And so how he does that is, everything looks more or less bare. The concrete, he purposefully left basically unfinished. It is rough-hewn concrete. There are holes left in it from when it was poured, when the concrete is poured into the mold. In fact, there are even gaps left to show that the concrete was not finished molding. And this is to meditate and ponder the idea of industry. Concrete is a material that is used in factories, that is an industrial material, but at the same time, it was originally perfected by the Romans. And the Romans used it for massive projects like the Pantheon and basilicas. So it has this back and forth idea to concrete. And leaving it unfinished in this purposefully unfinished state, you think about the creation of concrete. And also, it's beautifully overlaid with this geometric light fixture thing. It looks really industrial up close because they are basically polished aluminum plates. Like there's really nothing up there, and so imagine us being in a sea of aluminum. It looks like a factory, but it's a factory for modern art. So here again, we have repeated the concrete. Now here's where Marcel Breuer really gets to his functionalism, his powerful functionalist abilities, in that the ceiling here serves as rollers for the art. In other words, these walls, there are no walls in the original building. Walls are used by the museum, so they put the art on the wall, and then they basically they have strings on top of the wall, and they attach them to hooks, or attach them to rollers above the ceiling here, and they just move, they basically roll the wall along the grid here to where they need it. So it's an endlessly reconfigurable state. But what's the most famous part of the building probably is the staircase, which usually stairs are a neglected part of architecture because you can use elevators. But in this case, the stairs are what Marcel Breuer paid a lot of attention to. Again, we have the rough-hewn concrete, but here Marcel Breuer worked at the wood shop in the Bauhaus. That was a fundamental element of Bauhaus, that to be an architect, you need to understand materials. You need to work with materials with your hands. And so the wood here is really beautifully worked. It extends a whole way down. And at the joints here, it's actually two different kinds of wood combined sort of in this scissor pattern and it creates this sort of pattern of colors. You can see it sort of, but yeah, trust me. It's like light color, dark color, light color, dark color. And the wood is perfectly proportioned. It is actually really ergonomic. It's wonderful on your hands as to grip as you go down. And the last modernist work I'm going to be talking about is another, this architect Louis Kahn is often called a brutalist. I would not lump him with any group in modernism. He's just a modernist because it's really, really unique. He designed this in 1973, but because he died soon afterward and New York had a budget crisis and basically went into a huge recession, it was not built until 2012. And it's a memorial to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And it's built on Roosevelt Island. How suitable is that? You know, a memorial to Roosevelt on Roosevelt Island. And it's called Four Freedoms Park because that was one of the speeches that Roosevelt gave. FDR gave a speech that essentially said that, you know, America will now secure freedom from want, freedom from fear, etc., etc. And so it's a park commemorating that idea, and it's visually so fantastic. Louis Kahn is known as probably the greatest master of perspective and light. The idea that he actually can somehow, I don't know how he did it, and he was a bit of a recluse, so who knows, but somehow he was able to know exactly what you were seeing when you were in one of his buildings. And in this case, this is a really good example. This walk from here to back there is not that long, but it looks really, really long because he ramps up this walkway and he ramps down this wall here. That creates a visual effect of it being longer than it actually is. And also, this granite block here, these granite blocks are perfectly covering these trees so that you don't see, so that you only see the leaves. In addition, he uses sight lines. Those trees on top, they're designed in allées, which just means straight lines. They're designed in allées that perfectly frame a bust of FDR. Let's visit the park real quick. At the end of the park, when you finish walking through that walkway, you arrive at what Louis Kahn called the room. And the room has these wall-like structures that are large granite blocks. And one of the most important parts of the design, and something that Louis Kahn actually labored over for days, was the placement of these granite blocks. At the end of his day's labor, he realized that the perfect placement is so that each block had exactly 1 inch in between. And the purpose for that is so that light seeps through the blocks. So that if you stood right at that edge and you looked through, you could see the other side. But if you moved just a little bit off, you wouldn't be able to, but you'd still see that light coming through the tip. That's just amazing that he can predict basically your sight lines. And if we exit the room really quick, what we see is that if we look back, the alleys of trees have actually perfectly framed this building here, which is the ruined state of the smallpox hospital on Roosevelt Island. And it was actually designed by James Renwick Jr., the guy who designed St. Patrick's Cathedral. And so in an act of basically architectural homage, Louis Kahn has decided to frame in this sort of portrait frame this old building by another great architect, as well as Queensboro Bridge, a symbol of New York. Finally, I want to close off this section with a note at a great postmodern building, after modernism and defying modernism. While we saw in modernism curtain walls, continuous walls of steel and glass, this is the exact opposite. It puts bricks in and sort of closes off the building, gives it a sense of solidity. This is a really solid building. And the most famous part, right here. The building is, in a way, ironic. It's sort of making a joke, as if the building is a toy. But this is what postmodernism does in architecture. It's considering not how can we define a new context, a new vocabulary for architecture. It's not concerned with these haughty, very high-minded ideals. Rather, it's trying to defy that, saying, what right do you have to say that we need to live a certain way? What rights do you have to define how people should act? Because that's what modernism did. Modernism defined that people should be extroverts, because because entire walls will be covered by glass. It's defining a lifestyle of luxury by having these sleek skyscrapers. And postmodern says that's bourgeois, that's awful, that's evil. In a way, modernism is making popular this idea that you need to enjoy good art, you need to live like a king. You need to be able to afford, beautiful travertine elevator banks and these granite steps. Oh, look how bourgeois this guy is, And so purposefully, Philip Johnson in this building uses a less quality brick. It's sort of this older, sort of drab gray colored brick. Now, you've probably probably seen some old cabinet or some old wardrobe, and the top has looked sort of like this. It's a joke. It's turning a building into sort of a child's toy. It's inspired. The top is inspired by a piece of furniture made by a British designer named Thomas Chippendale, and the idea is that it's sort of a parody. That it's this humorous building reduced to its basic solid forms, and you could almost pick it up and play with it. I did want to include this middle picture here in that it's public space. This building has a large amount of public space behind it. And also, just to drive home this sort of postmodern idea of defying the modernist ideas, there's a reference to antiquity, which the modernists would never do. The modernists say that antiquity is bad, But here, this motif of having a large rounded section and then these rectilinear, rectangular sections, that's a reference to something called the Palladian motif or the Stirlian motif from Renaissance architecture. So it's not so much as pure geometry than considering a geometry that defies purity, that this is something that is about choice. You can decide how you want to live. We're not trying to assume things about you. We're trying to liberate architecture from assuming. And so these two ideas of modernism and postmodernism come together in the contemporary age, in today. Today, architects consider both of these schools of thought. Architects like Norman Foster, who's what's called a structural expressionist. In that the structure of the building, the structural engineering of the building defines the shape. The exterior of the building is in something called a diagrid, which is basically this grid pattern on the exterior. And these are actually very thick steel beams. And these steel beams are anchored down so that the building does not require any sort of, requires much less internal support. Essentially, the entire exterior is self-supporting. So that the interior of the building really only requires columns to support upper floors. There's no columns required to support the shell, the exterior shell. And this is the Hearst Tower, so it's the headquarters of the Hearst Corporation, publishing magazines. They do magazine publishing. But the issue when Norman Foster designed this building was that this lower part of the building is actually the old Hearst Corporation headquarters. And that was actually landmarked as a historical landmark. And so the issue is, how can I develop a new headquarters without destroying architectural preservation? Well, the answer is, I won't destroy the outside. I'll hollow out the inside and then build on top of it. And so in other words, he's integrating the old and the new in this beautiful and very influential synthesis. Now, a major feature of the Hearst Tower is energy efficiency. It was one of the earliest buildings to really push for energy efficiency. It catches rainwater on the roof and funnels the rainwater down to cool the building without using electricity. And also, there's this massive water feature on the lobby. And this water that's coming down this cascade comes from the roof. You'll also notice that the diagrid's big steel beams are coming down here. Later, we have probably the most important park that's been designed in recent history, the High Line. Now, a lot of people went into designing the High Line but since this is an architecture presentation, I chose to highlight the architects, Stiller, Scafidi, and Renfro. Now, what this really is all about combining the ideas of modernism and postmodernism. There's a lot of attention to details, like modernism, attention to the materials. This is a very high quality wood, very sturdy wood. And so there's modernist ideas and this sort of luxurious selection of materials. But at the same time, there's a postmodern idea of preservation, that it actually preserves. So what the High Line is there used to be a railway, an elevated railway in lower Manhattan through what is today Chelsea. Well, it was then as well. So the Chelsea and the meatpacking district, these neighborhoods had this railway so that rail cars carrying meat could come through and pick up meat from the meatpacking companies that were in Chelsea and the meatpacking district. However, today, New York no longer has much of any meatpacking, and so the railway went unused. And they were planning to demolish the railway. Fortunately, people spoke up, and the railway was preserved, and they decided to turn it into a public park. Basically, a long walkway. Now, one would think that it's modernist because it defies the street. It's sort of its own monolithic thing above the street. Well, they actually realized that and did a lot of care to counteract that. When you get on top of the High Line, the architects designed something called a slow stair. Essentially, the stairs have long landings so that you do a couple steps and then this long landing, a couple steps of long landing, so that before you get on top of the High Line, you're forced to stay at this middle ground and continue contemplating the street. So you continuously have a relationship with the street. In other sections of the High Line, they actually included parts where you step down into sections where you step down and then there's large glass panes where you see the streets from above. And so there's continuous dialogue between street and High Line. In this way, we really have the representation of postmodern ideas, in addition of place, that this is a site-specific piece, a site-specific work. It couldn't have done anywhere else other than the High Line. It conforms to the requirements of the geometry of the High Line. But also that these railings and such, they're actually preserved from the original Art Deco style railway. They preserved elements of the railway. And also a new trend in development is this idea of the luxury apartment. We're sort of returning to this Gilded Age idea of showiness, flashiness. In buildings like 432 Park Avenue, this is really, really famous already, even though it was designed only a few years ago. Raphael Vignoli, the architect, has become completely associated with this one building. The facade is quite beautiful. It's all marble, and the windows are tinted blue, and so it's very, very slender. It's extremely slender, actually. It's called a super thin tower, and it's purposefully much taller than its surroundings, and so it stands out in the sky. So it juts out much farther in the sky than the other buildings. And so the blueness of the window, since it's jutting out that far in the sky, complements the blueness of the sky. At the same time, the windows actually have a one-to-one relationship on all sides. So they're square windows. Now, the top floor penthouse has actually sold for $95 million. It's extremely ridiculous. It is the highest price in Manhattan. It is one of the priciest apartments in the world. And you can see why this is a bathroom of that $95 million apartment, and everything is marble. Marble floor, marble tile here, marble walls. There's glass doors to enter the bathroom. This bathtub is also marble. And look at the view. Empire State Building, One World Trade Center, Chrysler Tower. Jesus. So we have this return of the idea of luxury again. And also we have additional sort of new futurism. This return of that Aristotelan aesthetic of being really futuristic, but also with a tint of structural expressionism involved. So this is a building by Santiago Calatrava, also very, very attached to his career. It resembles a bird taking flight, or a bird just beginning to get up out of a nest, almost like a phoenix rising out of ashes. And that makes a lot of sense because this is actually the bus terminal for the World Trade Center. The subway goes through here, the bus goes through here, and there's also a shopping mall in it. And you can see that the bird has these great big wings, and it's called the oculus because the middle section is open with glass. You can see the outside through the middle section. The interior looks sort of cathedral-like. It's almost religious in just how bright it is. Everything is this extremely bright white, unbelievably white. It is controversial. It is one of the most popular projects done in recent history, and Calatrava is hugely notorious for doing it. But it does also have its critics, in that the oculus here has actually leaked, despite this building costing more than $1 billion and going way over its time, way over schedule. So there are those who will say that contemporary architecture is wasteful, but at the same time, it's just so illustrious that it's difficult to resist. Now, the last piece I want to feature is by Renzo Piano, which really combines the postmodern and the modern here. Again, it's on the waterfront, and so it has a blue tint to it. But this is the new Whitney. The Whitney Museum is here today, and it's a really wonderful museum. I highly recommend it. But it's actually on the High Line, so it's right off the High Line in the neighborhood called, I believe it's actually in the Meatpacking District. And so originally it was an industrial neighborhood, the Meatpacking District. You know, they did meatpacking. But this building symbolizes the fact that this neighborhood transitioned from this industrial neighborhood to a really, really high-class, very fancy arts district. And, you know, Chelsea is very famous for its very, very strong art scene. And so from one angle, it looks like this, with this massive cantilevered floor. But from another angle, it looks completely different. This is from the waterfront, looking from the waterfront. But if you look from the back, if you were standing on the High Line, this is what you'd see. Different angles reveal different buildings. It's a sort of postmodern idea of this individuality, that you can't determine how a building should look. I'm an individual. I'm going to design something that is powerful, that is illustrious. But at the same time, it's also very modern in its use of these industrial materials, steel and glass. But now we've reached really present day. We've reached, only 2 years ago. And we see a New York that has come a really, really far away from its roots in the 1600s. That has had its share of awful times to live in, had its time where it was filled with smog and crime and filth, to today where there's free Wi-Fi on the streets, where it's a very functioning city where almost every neighborhood has an art scene. That's the New York today.